The movie begins in 1952 with Jack asking a bartender for a drink. He notices two women dining at a table, one of whom, Therese, is an aspiring photographer and his friend. Jack joins them and inquires if Therese is attending a mutual friends party. Therese introduces him to her friend Carol, who then leaves, wishing them fun. On her way to the party, Therese gazes out the window and reminisces about her first meeting with Carol. The next morning, Therese wakes to find her boyfriend, Richard, waiting outside. He drives her to her job at Frankenberg's department store, where a man is handing out Christmas hats. After lunch, she prepares for the store's opening. Soon, the store fills with customers, including the glamorous Carol Aird, searching for a doll for her daughter, Rindy. Carol asks Therese for a specific doll that is out of stock, so Therese suggests a train set instead. Carol agrees, writes her address for the shipment, and leaves, forgetting her gloves on the desk. Later, Therese meets Richard again, and they go to a bar with two friends. On their way back, Danny, one of the friends, invites Therese to visit his workplace at the New York Times and offers to introduce her to a photo editor. Back at home, Therese mails the forgotten gloves to Carol using Frankenberg's sales slip with Carol's name and address. The next morning at Carol's home, she spends time with her daughter, Rindy, when her husband, Harge, arrives with the mail. It becomes clear that Carol is having a difficult time with Harge. Meanwhile, Therese asks the clerk about Carol's delivery, and he confirms it was received. Carol then calls Frankenberg to thank Therese for returning the gloves and invites her to lunch. At lunch, Carol shares that she is getting a divorce and asks Therese if she lives with someone. Therese talks about Richard and mentions her uncertainty about marrying him. Their lunch ends with Carol inviting Therese to her house the following Sunday. Outside, Carol's friend waits and drives her to a party where she dances with Harge as her mother-in-law watches from a distance. Later, standing by the window, Carol's friend Jeanette joins her for smoke and invites Carol to spend Christmas with her if she doesn't want to be alone. Carol declines, saying she wants to spend some time alone. Meanwhile, Therese visits Danny's workplace. They have beers, and during their conversation, Danny kisses her, but she feels uncomfortable and leaves. Harge drives Carol home and invites her to his parents' house, not wanting her to be alone on Christmas. Carol declines, saying Rindy will be ready for him at 4 on Christmas Eve. She goes inside, sees the train set she bought from Therese, and drinks alone. The next morning, Therese and Richard are outside, waiting for her ride. When Carol arrives in her car, Therese gets in. Carol meets Richard for the first time, and mentions that Therese often talks about him. On their way to New Jersey, Carol stops to buy a Christmas tree, giving Therese the chance to take some photos of her. They arrive at Carol's home, where Therese watches Carol decorate the tree with her daughter, Rindy. That night, Therese plays the piano, while Carol, wrapping Rindy's gift, listens. Carol approaches and compliments Therese on her piano playing. She asks about the photos Therese took and her passion for photography. Therese mentions she doesn't have a decent camera, and Carol invites herself to Therese's place to see her work. Harge arrives unexpectedly and sees Therese becoming suspicious. He tells Carol he needs to take Rindy to Florida for Christmas. Carol protests, saying Rindy is sleeping and not packed. Harge questions Therese about how she knows Carol, and she explains they met at the department store. Carol bids goodbye to Rindy as she leaves with Harge. Harge insists Carol come to Florida too, threatening that their marriage might be over if she doesn't. Carol shows no regret, so Harge leaves with Rindy. Inside, Carol tells Therese she'll drive her to the train station. On the train, Therese starts crying. When she returns home, she receives a call from Carol, who apologizes for her behavior and asks if she can come over to see Therese's work. The next morning, Carol visits her lawyer, Fred, and learns that Harge is petitioning the judge to consider a morality clause against her, threatening to expose her homosexuality and gain full custody of Rindy. Distressed, Carol leaves the office, lights a cigarette, and takes a walk by the side of the road. Meanwhile, Richard waits outside a store as Therese buys a Christmas gift. He walks with her and invites her to spend Christmas with his family. Therese declines, saying Christmas is for families and she is alone. Richard then asks her to come to Europe with him, professing his love. Therese walks away, and when Richard follows, she questions his understanding of love, asking his opinion about two boys in love. Richard asks if she loves another girl, to which she replies no. He proposes they go to France and get married. Angered, Therese tells him he needs to leave.
Carol drinks with her friend Abby and shares the news about Harge's case against her, mentioning that she plans to go away to avoid the stress. She also hints that she might ask Therese to join her on the trip.
Later, Carol arrives at Therese's place with a case full of cameras and equipment to support her passion for photography. She admires Therese's work, and they go to the roof to smoke. Carol mentions her legal situation and invites Therese on a road trip. Therese agrees.
The next morning, Richard and Therese fight. He is upset because she is going on a trip with Carol and suspects they might fall in love. He says he wants to marry her, but feels rejected because she is choosing Carol over him. And then he leaves. Therese packs her suitcase and writes a gift card for Carol.
Carol and Therese set off on their trip, stopping for lunch, where Therese gives Carol a Christmas present and takes some photos of her. Later, Carol drives through the night while Therese falls asleep. Harge arrives at Abby's place, looking for Carol, saying that Rindy needs to spend Christmas with her mother and that he, as her husband, needs to talk to her. Abby closes the door, saying Carol isn't there and she can't help him, so Harge leaves. Therese enters their motel room and sees Carol in the bathroom. Carol asks for her blue sweater from the suitcase. While retrieving it, Therese notices and briefly smells the sweater, but then sees a gun in the suitcase. She brings the sweater to Carol. As they continue their journey, Therese asks Carol if she is afraid or if there is anything she can do to help. That night, they stay at another motel. Therese goes outside for ice, and a man offers to help her fill the ice bucket. She returns to the room, plays music, and they both drink and talk. Later, Therese watches Carol sleep on her bed. The next morning, the same man approaches Therese and joins her for lunch. He introduces himself as Tommy Tucker, a traveling salesman. He tries to make conversation as Carol arrives. He mentions he is also heading to Chicago and suggests a shortcut. Therese and Carol continue their road trip, starting to enjoy themselves. That night, they stay at a luxury hotel. Carol falls asleep on the bed, while Therese sits on the sofa chair. Later, they go to the hotel's lobby for dinner. Therese checks her mail while Carol watches from a distance. Carol calls Harge but hangs up when he answers. Back at the hotel, as Therese sits in front of the mirror, Carol mentions that she and her husband never spend New Year's together. Carol approaches and they start kissing, eventually becoming intimate and spending the night together. In the morning, as Carol is checking out, she receives a telegram that makes her very angry. She asks Therese about her suitcase, takes out her gun, and runs to the room next to theirs. There, she discovers that Tucker is a private investigator, hired by Harge to gather evidence against her. Carol confronts Tucker, threatening him at gunpoint, but he claims to have already sent tape recordings to Harge. Carol throws her gun in the trash and calls Abby, explaining the situation and expressing her uncertainty about what to do next. Carol and Therese turn back, and on the way, Therese expresses her guilt over the trouble she caused, saying she should have stopped Carol when they first kissed. Carol stops the car and comforts her, assuring her it's not her fault and she shouldn't feel sorry. That night, they stay at a motel. Therese overhears Carol talking to Abby on the phone, who offers her support. As Therese makes her bed, Carol invites her to share the bed, and they become intimate again, spending the night together. The next morning, Therese wakes to find Abby sitting in front of her and learns that Carol left earlier. Later, during lunch, Therese asks why Abby dislikes her. Abby replies that she doesn't hate her and hands Therese a letter from Carol. Therese runs outside to read the letter, in which Carol explains that Tucker would have discovered their relationship eventually, so it's better it happened sooner. She tells Therese not to blame herself and to live her life happily, as that's all Carol wants for her. Therese returns home and develops the negatives of the photos she took of Carol. She then calls Carol, who picks up but doesn't say anything before hanging up. The next morning, Danny visits and looks at Therese's photographs, advising her to build a portfolio for a photography career. As she paints the wall, Danny asks about Carol, and Therese responds that it's complicated. Carol is having lunch with Harge and his parents, waiting for her daughter, Rindy, to arrive. When a car approaches, Carol runs outside and happily hugs her daughter. Meanwhile, Therese receives a box from a man and discovers it's filled with the pictures she took earlier. Carol meets up with Abby, expressing her pain of living without Rindy. Abby mentions that Therese has started a job at the New York Times. When a car approaches their driveway, Abby decides to leave. The next morning, Carol is in her car and sees Therese walking down the street, feeling happy to see her. Later, during a contentious meeting in mid-April with divorce lawyers, Carol admits to the truth of the tapes and refuses to deny her sexuality. To avoid a public scandal, she tells Harge he can have custody of Rindy if he allows her regular visits.
Carol writes to Therese, suggesting they meet at the lounge of the Ritz Tower Hotel. During their meeting, Carol reveals she is going to work for a furniture house and has taken an apartment on Madison Avenue, inviting Therese to live with her. Therese declines the invitation. Carol mentions she is meeting associates in the Oak Room and says that if Therese changes her mind, they can have dinner. Therese remains still, and Carol says, "I love you." They are interrupted by Jack, a colleague who hasn't seen Therese in months, and Carol leaves.
Therese accepts Jack's ride to a party, but finds she cannot connect with anyone there. She leaves for the Oak Room, where she scans the diners and spots Carol at a table. Therese hesitates, then walks toward Carol. Their eyes meet. The movie ends with Carol gazing at Therese, her smile slowly growing.